Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking a little bit about rejection. I'll be your therapist for today so that I can say that rejection is just a natural part of life. From relationships to job hunting to everything in between. It seems like everybody has a story from when they were job hunting, going from place to place, interview to interview, where they seemingly want you to have years of experience for a minimum wage job, and then you never end up hearing back from them. Like that time that I was interviewed to work at a warehouse, I forget what store the warehouse was for, and the interview all but hired me and told me that I would hear back in just a few days' time, and then I never heard from them ever again. Sadly, it's not as if that kind of story is unique. People being rejected for positions and being left completely out in the cold. The job market just plain sucks. Now, though, I want you to think about all the times you've been rejected in your life, and given a reason for that rejection. What was the stupidest reason that you were rejected, that you still look back on both confused and annoyed? My personal example of this is from a couple years ago. I wanted to try out some freelance writing, just to try it. Looking at various websites and publications that would publish user and reader essays and whatnot, I tried proposing a few ideas to Slate, as I like their more casual presentation and writing. I don't remember exactly what I proposed, but I was rejected on the basis that they did not publish articles with that kind of subject matter, so it was probably history related. Then, not too long afterward, I saw them publish multiple articles from various writers on very similar subjects, so now I have a vendetta against Slate. These mundane stories of mine aside, they do actually kind of relate to our subject for today, a mid-World War II era Japanese fighter design that was rejected, and rejected for a very stupid reason. See if you can guess why it was rejected. This is the Kawasaki Ki-96. However, we can't talk about the Ki-96 without talking about its predecessor. We gotta have a little context here. And for that context, we have to jump back to 1937, in Japan's effort to construct the Dragon Slayer. Around that time, other major militaries had been constructing and experimenting with heavy fighter designs. Heavy fighters as a concept are largely a relic of the 1930s and 40s, having been largely abandoned past World War II. But in the build-up to World War II, heavy fighters were incredibly enticing, offering far greater power, carrying capacity, and overall armament than your traditional single-engine fighters. Owing to these features, many a country tried making heavy fighters for long-range escort, interceptor, and just general fighter roles. However, their larger size often made them ineffective as fighters against smaller single-engine aircraft, but at the same time, their bulk did make them excellent candidates for other roles, like ground attacking, light bombing, and torpedo bombing. And Japan, realizing that everybody else was making these planes, didn't want to be left behind. Therefore, the Imperial Japanese military would issue in March 1937 some specifications for a new twin-engine heavy fighter. Initially, though, these specifications were effectively just that, a twin-engine heavy fighter, as the general concept of a heavy fighter was still new to the Japanese military. They weren't entirely sure what the specification should be. Should it prioritize speed? Should it prioritize bomb load? Should it prioritize total armament? They didn't really know, so they let the manufacturers just sort of play around with the idea. To these very broad specs, 3 companies would return designs: Nakajima the Ki-37, Kawasaki the Ki-38, and Mitsubishi the Ki-39. While I couldn't really find anything on what the Ki-37 design looked like, it appears as though that design was quickly abandoned. Mitsubishi too would quickly abandon the Ki-39 to focus on other projects, but the general design of the Ki-39 was likely something like this, as Mitsubishi would use the Ki-39 as some influence and reference on a later project known as the Ki-46, a reconnaissance aircraft. This would leave just Kawasaki's Ki-38 design as the last one standing, and that design looked at least similar to this. Kawasaki would produce a mock-up to be inspected, but the project was temporarily put on pause, as the Japanese military decided on what exactly the specifications of this plane should be. Once they had the actual specifications ready, in late 1937, Kawasaki was given both these specifications and orders to begin construction of a full-scale prototype, now dubbed the Ki-45. For this design, the Japanese military wanted a twin-engine two-seat fighter, with a top speed of 335 miles an hour, a flight endurance of just under 5 hours, 2 forward-firing guns and 1 rear-firing gun, and 2 Nakajima Ha-20 radial engines, with around 820 horsepower apiece. By January 1939, Kawasaki had a completed prototype, outfitted with 3 7.7mm machine guns, one of them rear-firing, and an optional 20mm cannon on the underside of the fuselage. When the first prototype took to the air in January 1939, the results were very disappointing. Owing to the engine nacelles causing too much drag, and the Ha-20 engines not actually outputting 820 horsepower, the top speed was well below 335. On subsequent prototypes, they would attempt to reduce nacelle drag and bring in some greater airflow to the engine to try and increase power, but these fixes would result in a top speed of just 298 miles an hour. Not terrible, but certainly not up to the military-issued specifications either. This would result in the project being halted until more powerful engines were selected. So from late 1939 to April 1940, the project would sit dormant, until the Japanese military came in and ordered that a new prototype be fitted with 2 Nakajima Ha-25 radials, each with around 1,000 horsepower. The fitting of these new engines would boost the top speed to upwards of 323 miles an hour. Combine these new engines and new top speed with some design changes that included an improved armament of 2 forward-firing 12.7mm machine guns to go along with the rear-firing 7.7mm gun, along with some slight improvements in the aerodynamics of the body. The Ki-45 would be approved for production, under the full name Army Type 2 Two-Seat Fighter Model A Toryu, simply referred to as the Ki-45 Ki-A. Production would begin in September 1941, and by August 1942, the Ki-45 would see its first deliveries to combat units. By October that same year, they would see their first combat missions in the skies over China and Southeast Asia. While the Ki-45 would likely not perform all that well against smaller single-engine fighters due to it being a heavy fighter, in its initial combat run it was actually very effective as a bomber interceptor, with a solid armament, or solid for a Japanese fighter design anyway, of 2 12.7mm guns and a 20mm cannon. The Ki-45 would quickly develop a reputation as a fantastic weapon against enemy B-24 liberators. And while not as proficient as its anti-bomber role, the Ki-45 proved itself to be a solid ground attacker and anti-shipping aircraft, in part due to the solid armament, in part to it being more armored than your typical Japanese fighter, and thus more durable. In essence, Japan had a very solid multi-role aircraft at their disposal. In order to improve its ability as a ground attacker and anti-shipping aircraft, though, a new variant known as the Ki-45 Ki-B would fit a new armament of just 2 forward-firing guns, but they were one 20mm cannon in the nose and one 37mm cannon under the fuselage. The 37mm would actually be hand-fed, presumably by the co-pilot, which would reduce the overall offensive potential. Then, as Allied forces began increasingly utilizing night bombing as a natural defense, the Ki-45 would see another variant in the Ki-45 Ki-C. This one would run into a bit more trouble, though, as the necessary radar that would have to be installed in the nose was not yet ready, so it would end up being a night fighter without any form of radar, a little bit of a rarity. If that radar had been installed, the forward-firing armament would likely just have been one 37mm now semi-automatic cannon, as the nose would be occupied by the radar. Without the radar, though, the nose could be used to house two 20mm cannons, both of them installed in a slight upward angle, as they would be attacking bombers that were above them. Additionally, the C model would have slightly improved Mitsubishi Ha-102 radial engines, with 1,050 horsepower apiece. This ended up improving the top speed to about 340 miles an hour. Now, this is where we get to the Ki-96. In August 1942, just as the Ki-45 was entering service, Kawasaki began working on a potential down-the-line successor to the Ki-45 in the Ki-45 Toryu. Apparently, this was done without the direction or guidance of the Japanese military. Kawasaki was just making a prediction that the Ki-45 would end up being replaced shortly, so it was planned for the 45 Toryu to use two Mitsubishi Ha-112 engines, likely a later, more powerful subvariant of them, with around 1,500 horsepower to its name. This would end up being the same engine that was used on the Kawasaki Ki-100, a late-war fighter that just about matched America's P-51 in one-on-one combat. It's also a plane that I made a video on a few weeks ago. Make sure you watch it on loop forever. Having two of these high-power engines would certainly give the 45 Toryu much improved top speed and greater potential to carry stronger weaponry. Additionally, they would enlarge the frame ever so slightly. The baseline Ki-45 would be 11 meters long, 15.02 meters wide, and 3.7 meters tall. The 45 Toryu would have the same height, but it would be an extra half a meter longer at 11.45 and half a meter wider at 15.57. Along with a slightly different tail design, these slight body alterations were likely done to improve handling and control, perhaps having something to do with the greater engine power as well. And with this greater engine power, the standard armament for the interceptor/ground attacker could be two 20mm cannons and one 37mm cannon, a major improvement over the baseline Ki-45 Ki-A and its two 12.7mm machine guns and one 20mm cannon. The potential for this plane was certainly there, but at least initially the Japanese military just didn't care. At first, the Japanese military considered the design to be of low priority, owing to the fact that the Ki-45 had just started seeing combat. They simply didn't see the need for a new design at this moment, and specifically not a new two-seat heavy fighter. And as the Ki-45 performed rather well in its interceptor and ground attack roles, then certainly they wouldn't see much need for the 45 Toryu yet. Still, the Japanese military would throw Kawasaki a bone and authorize the production of 3 prototypes, likely still as low priority, as the Ki-45 baseline variants were still under production and upgrades. However, in December 1942, the Japanese military would make a small design change request that would breathe some life into the Ki-45 Toryu, and that was for a heavy fighter that housed just a single pilot, not two. This meant that the Ki-45 Toryu could proceed under the new designation Ki-96, as a single-seat heavy fighter. The removal of the co-pilot meant that the rear-facing 7.92mm machine gun was removed, giving the plane no rear defense. Still, with the potentially much improved performance, that likely didn't matter all that much, as the Japanese military had some actual distinct specifications for the Ki-96 now. Design of this plane would accelerate through the first half of 1943, and by September the first prototype was completed. Despite now being independent of the Ki-45, the first prototype actually looked just about identical to it. This was because the Ki-96 actually started out as a two-seat Ki-45 Toryu. A good portion of the fuselage had already been completed, including the cockpit and canopy. Instead of changing that for the prototype, they elected to just keep the extended canopy for now and have the back half of it sit empty, just longing for the days it had a co-pilot in there. This little design relic would only be present in the first prototype, though, and the two subsequent prototypes that were made just about in parallel would have a smaller canopy to reflect the single-seat status. So, as they were all finished in September 1943, all of them would partake in the initial flight testing that month, and the results were fantastic. With a relatively light gross weight of 13,228 pounds, the Ki-96 would manage a top speed of 373 miles an hour at roughly around 20,000 feet, along with displaying excellent handling and control. With this kind of performance and the overall layout and design of this plane, it looked as though Japan had a clear potential successor to the Ki-45, and perhaps sort of their own version of Britain's de Havilland Mosquito. Which is why it both pains and kind of delights me to say that the Japanese military completely ignored the good performance of the Ki-96, and it would never advance past the prototype phase. Now let's put on our brainstorming hats. Why exactly did the Japanese military reject the Ki-96? For a more sensible reason, perhaps there could have been some shortage in the Ha-112 engine that it was supposed to use. If they didn't have solid access to those engines, then it wouldn't really be viable as a plane right yet. Or maybe there were some production issues at the Kawasaki factories. As they were still working on the Ki-45 and its variants, maybe the military would have prioritized the production of an already in-production plane. After all, Japan would prioritize the production of the Zero over other more advanced aircraft, so them prioritizing the Ki-45 certainly wouldn't be shocking. However, none of these more sensible reasons would be why the Japanese military ignored the Ki-96. No, the real reason was that before the Ki-96 took to the air in September 1943, the Japanese military decided to go back on their design specs for the Ki-96, and just decided out of nowhere that they did not want a single-seat heavy fighter anymore. Now, I don't know why, but this kind of irrationally annoys me. Why did they even give Kawasaki those specs, only to just turn around and say no for seemingly no reason, even though the plane performed very well and potentially could have given Japan their very own Mosquito? So yes, the Ki-96 basically ended before it could begin, but from its ashes would rise two more potential aircraft. As the Japanese military went back to only wanting a two-seat heavy fighter, Kawasaki would take the Ki-96 almost in its entirety and transform it back into a two-seater, keeping the same dimensions and the same Ha-112 engines with 1,500 horsepower each. This new design was intended to serve as a multi-role attacker, but leaned towards being a ground attacker. As the ground attacking role would now be the major focus, the new design would have an improved armament, with the 37mm cannon being replaced with a 57mm cannon, along with there being the return of a rear-facing machine gun, this time a 12.7mm. Additionally, there was to be more armor on the underside. This change would increase the gross weight by about 3,000 pounds, up to 16,094, and it would also reduce the top speed down to 360 miles an hour. Even with this reduction, though, it was a two-seater now, which Japan was desperate for, I guess, and the performance was much better than the Ki-45. So after successful flight testing in March 1944, the Ki-102 was officially ordered into production in October 1944. Additionally, the Japanese military would order two other variants of the Ki-102, in the Ki-102A and Ki-102C. The standard version of this plane was the B, oddly enough. The Ki-102A was to be a high-altitude fighter variant, desperately needed as Allied bombing attacks on Japan were ramping up. These models would replace the 57mm cannon with a 37mm, so basically they just made the Ki-102A back into the Ki-96 again, so what's the point of anything anymore? Then the C variant was intended to be a night fighter, intercepting attacking night bombers. The armament would be two 30mm cannons and two 20mm cannons. Of these three Ki-102 models, the baseline B model would be the most common, and it would see very limited use over the skies of Okinawa, but the other two would not see use before the war ended. And as a derivative of the Ki-102, though, the Ki-108 would be born, albeit with just a handful of models. The Ki-108 was to be an improved night fighter/interceptor with a pressurized cockpit and slightly altered dimensions and control surfaces. However, these also amounted to very little before the war ended. In the end, only the Ki-45, with the project starting back in 1937, made any kind of noticeable mark in World War II, as a pretty solid bomber-destroyer and night fighter, while it's not as if Japan lived or died on having an improved heavy fighter/interceptor/ground attacker. One does have to wonder if it would have made any noticeable change in Allied bombing effectiveness should a plane like the Ki-96 have made it past the prototype phase. Could it potentially have been Japan's Mosquito, or perhaps Japan's P-38? It's certainly not out of the question. Unfortunately for them, though, the Japanese military decided to completely ignore the excellent performance of the Ki-96 for just about no good reason. Sometimes the performance of a plane truly does not matter. It may live or die on the whims of the leadership of the country that it serves. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. You know, when I was reading about the Ki-96, the little saga reminds me of a scene from SpongeBob, where there's this dad with his crying kid, and the kid's complaining that he doesn't like pistachio ice cream, and the dad, trying not to scream at him, just goes, "Then why did you ask for it?" It's kind of like the exact same thing. Japan's that kid, and they really don't like pistachio ice cream. I don't want a single-seat heavy fighter. Then why did you ask for it? But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.